This book is called Grace for President. Some of you might have read it, some of you might not have not. I don't know. I've read this one year to a class, but I wasn't sure which class it was. One Monday morning in September, Mrs. Barrington rolled out a big poster with all the president's pictures on it. Grace Campbell could not believe her eyes. Where are all the girls? That's a very good question, said Miss Barrington. The truth is, our country has never had a woman president. No girl president? Ever? Grace asked. No, I'm afraid not, said Mrs. Barrington. Grace sat at her desk and stewed. No, girls, who ever heard of a crazy thing? Finally, she raised her hand. Yes, Grace, I've been thinking it over, and I'd like to be president. Several students in the class laughed. Well, I think that's a star-spangled idea, Grace, said Mrs. Barrington. In fact, we have our own election right here at Woodrow Wilson Elementary. The snickering in the room stopped. Grace smiled. Would anyone else like to run for president? Mrs. Barrington asked the class. Nobody raised their hand. Becoming president was going to be easy, Grace thought. Ignore the blue mark. I don't know where that came from. The next day, Mrs. Barrington made an announcement. In the name of democracy, I have invited Mr. Waller's class to join our election. Their class has nominated Thomas Cobb to be their presidential candidate. Grace's heart sank. Thomas was the school's spelling bee champion. His experiments always took the blue ribbon at the science fair, and he was captain of the soccer team. Becoming president wasn't going to be easy after all, Grace thought. Okay. What do you think Grace is feeling at this point? It hasn't said it in the book, but what do you think that she is feeling? That's a really good guess, because I get maybe disappointed too, just because like another person is running and like she thought it was going to be so easy because she's the only person. The teachers put names of all 50 states and the District of Columbia in a hat. Everyone except for Grace and Thomas got to choose a state. I'm Texas, said Anthony. I'm New Hampshire, said Rose. I'm Michigan, said Robbie. What does the number 17 mean? Each state is assigned a number of electoral votes. That number determines how many people live in that state. Each of you will be a representative for your state. Altogether, the country has 538 electoral votes, Mr. Waller explained. On election day, the candidate who receives 270 electoral votes or more wins the election. Why 270? Asked Rose. That's more than half of the electoral votes, Mr. Waller said. Becoming president really wasn't going to be easy, Grace thought. Okay, who would you pick for? If it was determined if you were going to pick Grace or Thomas, who would you pick? Okay, raise your hand if you would pick Grace. Okay, you can put your hands down now. Raise your hand if you pick Thomas. Okay, you can put your hands down. I noticed that more boys put their hands up. Grace came up with a campaign slogan. Thomas came up with his own campaign slogan. Make history. Vote for Grace Campbell for president. Vote for Thomas Cobb, the best man for the job. Grace listened to what issues were important to the students, and she made a list of campaign promises. No school women, a peaceful school, no bullies. A cleaner school, no littering. Better hot lunches, no more fish stick tacos. Thomas made up his own list of promises. Free tutoring, free soccer lessons, fish stick tacos every week. Grace made campaign posters and buttons. Thomas made posters and buttons too. Why do you think that every time Grace does something, Thomas does something? Why do you think that is? Lesson.
Because they both want to be president.
Okay.
Thomas wants to show off Grace.
Okay. That's a pretty good idea. You in the back.
Probably he's copying to get it right so he can just win because he wants to win so he can be president.
That's a good idea. It's a good prediction. Well, probably like an inference, just because you have some information. Every week, the teacher set aside time for candidates to meet with their constituents. I can't say that. You know words that you just can't say? Yeah, I can't say some words. Polls were taken. Voters were making their choices. Okay, what do you notice in this picture? Tell me what you notice. This picture is one of the most important pictures. What about you?
I noticed that there's a lot of rules and that stuff, and there's a lot of laws and that stuff on the school, and it just looks like she's winning because
All the boys are voting for
Oh, sorry.
Thomas, and all the boys are voting for Thomas, and all the girls are voting for Grace.
That's right, but there's a special thing in this page. Has anybody noticed this? There's a guy looking at her, like the whole thing over there, and so that's a big part of the story. Grace continued to campaign. At recess, she gave speeches. During lunch, she handed out free cupcakes. After school, she held rallies. So Grace is doing a lot of work. Meanwhile, Thomas wasn't worried. He had cleverly calculated the boys held slightly more electoral votes than the girls. At recess, Thomas studied his spelling words. During lunch, he worked on a science experiment. After school, he played soccer. So Thomas isn't worried at all, and Grace is like going through all these things, trying really hard. Even before the election, Grace made good on her promises. She joined the safety squad. She organized a school beautification committee. She volunteered in her time in the school cafeteria. In early November, Woodrow Wilson hosted a special Election Day assembly. Grace and Thomas took their places on stage as the school band began to play. Henry was the first representative to approach the microphone. The Yellowhammer State of Alabama casts its 9 electoral votes for Thomas Cobb. The last frontier of state of Alaska casts its 3 electoral votes to the best man for the job, Thomas Cobb. Then Hannah called out. The Grand Canyon State of Arizona casts 10 electoral votes for Grace Campbell. And so it went, state after state after state, until they cast their electoral votes. The scoreboard in the gymnasium kept track of the totals. The voting demonstration was quickly coming to an end. Clara approached the podium. The Badger State of Wisconsin cast its 10 votes to my best friend, Grace Campbell. Grace looked at the scoreboard. Thomas had 268 electoral votes. She had 267. There was only one state still unaccounted for. Wyoming. Okay, so look at that. Who do you think he's going to vote for? You can raise your hand.
I forgot.
Okay. Azoria.
Grace.
Okay, that's a good guess. A really good guess. He could vote for either. Do you think he's going to... Wait a minute. Who thinks he's going to vote for Thomas? No one?
Say like Grace. I like this.
Thomas grinned. Grace felt sick. Sam walked up to the microphone. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Grace. He looked down at Grace's handmade flag. Sam didn't say a word. "What are you waiting for?" Thomas whispered. The band stopped playing. All eyes were on Wyoming. Finally, Sam cleared his throat. The equality state of Wyoming casts 3 electoral votes for Grace Campbell. The gymnasium erupted with loud cheers and a few boos just because some of the people wanted Thomas. Mrs. Barrington approached the podium. With 270 electoral votes, the winner is Grace Campbell. Thomas looked stunned. Grace hugged Sam. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Sam handed Grace his flag. "Because," he said, "I thought you were the best person for the job." The following week, the students in Mrs. Barrington's class were preparing for the career day presentations. Grace volunteered to go first. She stood up at the front of the room and glanced at the poster still hanging on the wall. "My name is Grace Campbell, and when I grow up, I'm going to be the President of the United States of America."
Look at that picture. She gets to the United States.
This is actually a good lesson because Sam, the boy who had Wyoming, he didn't vote for the boy just because he didn't vote for Thomas because I think that he saw that he wasn't doing any work. As you noticed, like, there was one page where he was just doing his regular thing, like there was no election at all. And that actually, and then there's Grace on the other hand, who was just working to try to get everything up. And he did a couple things, but he didn't really do a lot. And I think Sam thought that if he wasn't going to do that, he was going to vote for someone who actually cared and tried to do those things. And so he just because he's a boy doesn't mean just because you're a boy. If we ever have a president thing, just because you're a boy doesn't mean you have to vote for the person that is a boy. If there's two different, like a boy and a girl, just because you're a boy, you don't have to vote for a boy. Just because you're a girl, you don't have to vote for a girl. You should vote for whoever you think has done the best job, has impressed you. Okay, that was a long statement.
What do we say, friends?
Thank